So we're here to solve this LITS puzzle by wormsofcan. It has a really interesting challenge to it, and it's kind of hard until you actually stare at it for a bit to see why that challenge comes about. Some of it is that I think there's only one or two cells that are forced logically to be shaded or unshaded at the start. This is a central cell in a region that there's no tetromino shape that doesn't include it. There are some regions like these that are 8 cells in total. So, at least one of these cells is marked, but that's not a tremendously helpful marking. At least one of these cells is marked. That's not a tremendously helpful marking. At least one of these cells is marked. And so there's something less common to be thinking about to really make progress in the grid. And one of the things that may stand out to you is there's a central dividing line. I guess that's part of the constructor's kind of creative steps in this puzzle. But a more general thought is actually where certain kinds of region shapes always form the same kinds of tetrominos. And there's a part of this puzzle which has a lot of what I would call snake-shaped regions. They're one cell wide. They bend around, but effectively, as I go across those shapes, if I shade this cell, I know exactly the form I make next to it, which is an I. If I shaded here, but not here, I'd make an L, I'd make an L, I'd make an L, I'd make an L. And so this region has two options to it, a big I and lots of L's. This region has an L, an L, an L, finally an S, an L, an L, an S, and an S. This has an L, an L, an L, an S, and an L. And the deduction that you've got to get to, which will take some time, is to see that a lot of the cells along this edge are only able to make L tetromino shapes. Up here, this is an L, this is an L. So if I actually mark some of the cells that can only make one shape overall, this can only be part of an L, this can only be part of an L, this can only be part of an L, this is only part of an L, this is always part of an S, always part of an L. And I'm marking these in even other parts of the grid because it's helpful to know how these come about. This is always part of an I, this is always part of an I, this is always part of an L, this is always part of an L, this is always a part of an L. And that's even in this case where it's got 3 options, but all of those 3 options are L's. This is always in an I, this is an L, 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 all the way actually to here is still forced to be an L. And we'll eventually see that a ton of this puzzle is limited by L-shaped cells, and specifically near the center. This is the first cell. This has an S option to it. This is still L, 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 L. Actually, this can now be an I. So, sorry, these 3 cells are all L's. And then this is I and other stuff. So the first key step to break into this grid is to see that effectively at the start, there is no connection through the center in these cells. And that's because the only shapes that can exist in the cells to the left and right of that boundary are L or I tetrominos. And L tetrominos can't touch L tetrominos over an edge. So just because of the limit of the shapes that happen here, these are hard borders that don't get crossed. And so the border that must be crossed is down here. And that means at least one of these 4 cells and at least one of these 4 cells are shaded so that these groups connect. And so we'll mark this as impossible because it would put too much away from the edge. Mark this as impossible. At the very least, this cell is shaded and this cell is shaded. But in practice, if I shade everywhere from this I cell up, I force another I cell to the left. So this is also not shaded. And I know for sure I'm making an L up top, which means that this L is touching to an I. And the only I can form now that will connect to this group is actually the one that's coming all the way across. And so the star of the puzzle is recognizing that there's a very specific thing happening on this edge. It's actually thinking outside the boxes into this center region, but we form this I, this L. We can't have L's touching L's, so all these cells nearby that were forced to be L's aren't possible. And even this connection here can't come in because it's also now going to form an L in some shape. And so we end up with a situation like this. Even this cell is forced to be an L, so that's also not usable. So we still need to stay connected, and the connection through this tetromino is going to come through this cell. It's the only cell left for it, and it's not going to have much reach now to get much further outside the grid. And looks like an option is here. This is not an option. So in all cases, this cell will be shaded. Otherwise, it puts an L here. And we should keep in mind that whatever tetromino we put in here needs to stay connected to the rest of the grid still above. And so we're going to have to be bridging through these cells somehow to get up there. And so the tetromino in the lower region is not in these cells. It's going to have to be connecting through one of these cells and going no further out than what I've just marked. And that's to say that even this option down here, if you shade it in this T, would mark unusable all the cells that keep the grid connected. So this is not usable. This is usable, must be used actually, because we've got this tetromino shape. Taking this would make an L, so we can't take that, but we can take this, form an S, one cell to stay connected right above. So we mark that in. This now, by 2 rules, marks off a set of squares. Actually, all of these are unusable. We're left behind with just enough to form this T shape, which goes in the grid, cancels out, puts an L here. Again, 1 point to stay connected. And here we're actually going to find that the middle and end stages of the puzzles are pretty easy because of just staying connected across the whole space. There's not a lot of work that happens. This cell would only form an L shape, whichever it takes, and so an L by an L is impossible. So got to shade out from here. It's got two options, could come all the way to here to form another L. That's also no good next to an L, so put in a T, marks these as unusable. Still for connectivity, this cell has to be shaded. Puts in this L shape. We've now got two regions left on this right side. They must stay connected, but not through that cell. And now by 2 not through this cell. So it's got to be this L and this L, and they're connecting together. With this cell not marked anymore, we now have a 2 rule problem. So we've got 6 cells left to go. And you can see quickly that the I is perfect here, but let's sort of show you why any other cell isn't. If you take off either of these edges, you're going to need to force a 2 in the P pentromino that remains. And that will force off this cell, which will force an L shape. So there's no S shape or T shape that's possible in the space because you can't take 3 cells of these groups. You always had to take at least 2 and at least 2. And anytime you take 2 across, you form an L. So it's conclusively shown that the I comes straight up, and that completes the right side. And let's now come to the left side, and we're going to see in the same way, now that we have this break-in, this I nucleates a lot of the rest of the solve. This cell can't be used because it would be another I near this I, so the connection has to come through these cells, and these are too close and would form 2 by 2 squares if they were taken, but we can take these. And can't take this, it would be another I, so we come up and form this shape. Using this cell would form another L, so the connection isn't there. It's got to be up here, but it's got to not be an L shape. This cell at the start and the cell at the start could have been marked with L, so they're now quickly marked as impossible because of that L limitation. So we get to here. We can mark all these cells now as unusable. Only one cell to connect through, which is this one, so it's got to be the one that's used. Forms this I shape. Got a few options for what comes from here, but we should note that we've got to keep the whole grid connected. So there's going to be a connection that's coming through these cells into one of these shapes. Note that if it didn't use this top part, if it came like this, it actually wouldn't leave a connection down here. So at least one of the 3 cells I just circled is shaded, which means this cell and this cell are immediately marked off. And so we've got now a channel of the grid that doesn't have anything available for it except to use these 2 cells. And through these 2 cells, we're limited straight away to results like this. And this has to connect over to these. So we can quickly say that it's not the right option. And it's also not the option that takes this cell, because if it took this cell, it has to immediately come up and form another L. So just good LITS thinking, but through a constrained part of the side. And These two can't reach all the way out to here, so to stay connected, it's got to take this cell, and L versus S, it's right next to an L, so it's going to come up like this. That takes these 3 cells. It's still got to connect through this shape to stay connected. This is the only cell that sees this region anymore, so we'll just shade in exactly that tetromino. And it's got to avoid being another L, so it's not here, and it's the I. And that gets us all the way through this really challenging puzzle from Worms of Can. Not as common in LITS puzzles to mark these cells by letters, but in any tricky grid, even when there's not something, I guess after 5 minutes you might say, is staring you in the face in terms of this really solid line, 9 columns in the center of the grid. Seeing where you have these impenetrable edges was actually the full key to this puzzle, that a hard boundary that keeps the grid fully separated across these cells. And even across cells like this, these are places that will help you see in some of the more challenging situations where you've got limitations, and those limitations add together to how the puzzle solves out. Once that was marked and we knew it was an I and an L, this being the big aha, once you see that, it is really standard LITS to the right and left. Probably the hardest and most interesting step is the limitation, this channel that quickly sets and fixes these upper left regions, at least in this turning of the puzzle. The original puzzle was vertical. So hope you enjoyed this grid a lot. I certainly did. It was a challenging solve when I first got to it, and getting to the back of my inventory of notations with these cell-constrained letters was the trick to finally seeing the way through. So we'll see you again soon.